No one is looking at a prediction market and saying, oh, 6 months ago, it said this.
It's a reflection of what percentage odds this person has of winning the election by people just betting on it.
Nearly half of all voters identify as politically homeless.
How to win being Trumpy, but not being Trump.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of The Polling Alley, the Overton Insights podcast, where we will break down polling data and trends shaping today's political landscape. I'm your host, Olivia Michels, the poll analyst here at Overton Insights. Today, I'm joined by Mark Cunningham, the Overton Insights poll director. Mark has helped shape Overton Insights' data-driven success through 3 national polls, building a brand increasingly referenced in national media. Mark is also the founder of the Beacon Poll, a Tennessee statewide poll. I'm also joined by Michael Melendez. Michael is the former director of polling in Western Region for the Trafalgar Group, where he worked during the 2016 election cycle. Michael has also co-founded his own consulting firm, Tactical Campaigns, where he continues conducting internal polls through their research arm, Revel Research. Now, I know Mark and Michael are both ready to dive in, so let's get into it today. First, I want to start out by talking about something kind of gaining traction and attention in the polling conversation, and that is prediction markets. People are starting to say prediction markets are coming for your jobs, and they're gaining all of this attention. So people are citing these results in Polymarket, Kalshi, and these other, betting markets and comparing them to how traditional pollsters are conducting presidential races, other political campaigns. So, Mark, can you tell us exactly what a prediction market is and kind of set that stage for us?
Yep. So as the gambler of this group, I will be happy to talk about that. So essentially what prediction markets do is it's essentially just the stock market for political races. So the way these work, whether it's Kalshi, Predicted, Polymarket, they'll have a percentage. So if they think, Donald Trump had a 60% chance of winning, you can buy him at 60%. If he goes up to 70, you can cash that out and you can make money on it. If he goes down to 50, you can cash out and you lose money. So it's essentially a reflection of what percentage odds this person has of winning the elections. And again, it's done by people just betting on it. It has nothing to do with, there's no bots, it's people saying, I think Donald Trump has a better than 60% chance of winning right now, so I'm going to buy this stock, essentially. So it's really kind of, because it's illegal to bet on actual politics in the U.S., this is the way they get around that rule, and it's a stock market type thing.
So do you think that this is comparable to sports betting, for instance?
Yeah, it's comparable to sports betting, except you have a cash out option at any point. When you bet on a sports game, I mean, some of the FanDuel will give you cash out options, but it's essentially you're betting on a team to win. You either win or lose. This one, you can win a little, it might go down. You can buy more. It really is more equivalent to the stock market than it is sports betting, but it's kind of a mix of those two.
Okay.
Mark, just a quick question. Are there more like prediction market type sports gambling apps that are not like the traditional stuff, but more like the politics stuff?
Yep. Well, those are starting to happen because there's some states where it's not legal for sports betting. So they kind of put this into place like, oh, we can get around the rules or skirt the rules. So yeah, and that is something that's becoming, and even, I saw FanDuel and DraftKings are both working on a structure that might look more like that. So it's really about giving people more options.
Cool.
And we've seen some of this in certain states where there are, ongoing legal battles as to whether or not this is considered gambling and whether the states have any sort of, ground to say you can or cannot participate in these prediction markets in those states. So, Mark, do you have a take on that? Do you think that it should be, allowed as something that's different? It's more like the stock market, or do you think these states have any ground to kind of say that?
Well, I think betting should be legal everywhere. So I think my personal opinion is it should be legal regardless. I don't understand why the government's getting involved in that. But no, it really is different. It's the same way that we talk about poker is a skill game. It might be gambling, but it's a skill game. So it is different than your traditional like house edge, casino edge. So I think it should be legal. I think Michael agrees with me on that one.
Well, Mark just disclosed, we are philosophically libertarians here. So there you go.
All right. Okay. Well, Michael, can you tell us about how a traditional poll is different than these prediction markets? And what would you say are the big changes to how we can interpret the results of either one?
I think that at the end of the day, there actually isn't a huge difference. The difference is the question being asked. And so in traditional polling, usually you're asking, who are you going to vote for? But a prediction market is asking a different question, which is, who do you think is going to win? And studies have shown that if you ask that question in a poll, that question is going to be more accurate than asking who do you think, or than asking who are you voting for. So that's the big thing, and that's what we found back in 2016 when Trafalgar predicted that Trump was going to win. It's because we were asking a different question.
Do you think we will see a shift in more traditional pollsters asking these type of questions versus just who will you vote for to try and get kind of more stay in competition with these prediction markets?
I'm going to guess that traditional pollsters themselves are not going to look into that, but I think you're going to see new entrants into this marketplace with a host of different ideas, because it's not just this. There's AI modeling, there's thinking about emotion and behavior of different people and how you can incorporate that into polling. So I think that with technology and a lot of new ideas, this will be one of them, right? Because anybody coming in who's like, I want to be accurate and I want to find the right answer, are going to start asking different questions than what people have been asking in the past.
So do you think these prediction markets are accurate?
I think they're going to be more accurate because they're asking a better question, which is, who do you think's going to win?
Okay. And Mark, what would you say the role that, money plays in this versus in a traditional poll, it's more so people are just, they can offer whatever opinion they want, whereas in these prediction markets, they're actually having to put money behind their response.
Well, yeah, and I mean, that's why prediction markets are more, I mean, they're certainly more accurate because people are actually saying, like you said, I'm going to bet on somebody I am not going to vote for because I think they're going to win and there's value there. People don't, they can take away their own personal biases and say, if I'm putting my money on the line, it's going to be for a good, statistical bet. The one piece that's I think is important too, and we might get into this later, is there's a lot of polls. Some of them are not good. They should not be weighted equally. And polls are the number one factor in what happens on poly market. People look at polls and say, this has been historically accurate. This is a good poll. And it shows this guy or this girl winning. So people are using the best polls to make their decision making. So even when you talk about, of course, there's some demographic information, maybe early voting, because, the prediction markets go from, 2 years beforehand, and then it updates as the votes are coming in. But before that starts, it's like 95% polls that people are using the polls to determine where they should put their money. So they do go hand in hand.
I think Mark brings up an interesting point, and he said it about the updating of the market, right? So a prediction market is updating all the time. And that's actually where I would say the difference between a prediction market and a poll is, again, not that significant. I think that no one is looking at a prediction market and saying, oh, well, back in 6 months ago, it said this, or a month ago, it said this. But that's
Right.
usually how people look at polls, is they're like, oh, well, what was it like in comparison to the final result? Which is actually not a very good question. And polling is typically a snapshot. But people don't treat a prediction market as a snapshot. They just look at where was it at the very end and how did it go. And so most polls are not predictors of the actual end result. Polls are really a snapshot of where is the voting populace at the time. Now, I would correct that statement for, polls that are right before the election and what's happening right as we go into the election, and we can talk about that. But most polls are not actually predictors of the final result because they're a snapshot.
Right.
Yeah.
And that,
Oh,
go ahead, Mark.
I was gonna add on to his point because I think that that's the biggest point you make. If you're 6 months out, they're like, oh, well, you had Hillary up by 9 points. Like, well, that's what we had at that point. It ended with Trump up one or whatever, and that's why the Seltzer poll specifically in Iowa was so insulted, because they had a poll that showed Harris up in Iowa like 2 days before the election. So like that's one where it's like that's bad polling.
Yeah.
What it showed in September, August might not be representative of where it's at now. Nobody says, oh, the prediction market was wrong 9 months ago. It's like, no, things have moved since then, including polls. So I definitely agree on that.
Right. And that brings me to the next point I want to bring up, which is talking about the 2024 presidential election. So, this is kind of going along with Michael's point about different polls and how I want to look at the Real Clear Politics average going into the election on November 4th. So, this showed basically a virtual tie with Harris leading by point 0.1. And I know Michael is going to have some things to say about that statement, which I want to get into, but I want to compare what people are seeing when they look at that compared to when they look at these prediction markets like Polymarket, who had Trump likely to win for weeks beginning in, the beginning of October. Yet even right before the election, we see these Real Clear Politics averages showing a very different story. So, Michael, what's your take on that, and where do you think that people might get tripped up looking at those two numbers?
Well, Olivia, in case you don't have this number, I'd love for you to bring this number up, and that is how much did the prediction market think that Trump was going to win the popular vote? I'd like to know what that number is because Real Clear, I think, had Trump up, what, 1 point, or no, they had Harris up 0.1 and Trump won 1.5, right? So statistically, within the margin of error, not really that far off on predicting the popular vote. Um, what actually matters is the Electoral College. And if you look at the no toss-up map for Real Clear Politics, they had all swing states going for Trump. And that was the final result. And that was the result that actually matters in American presidential elections. So in that sense, it was very accurate. And then my point of why does Real Clear show Harris up 0.1 rather than showing Trump up is because a lot of the polls are out there pushing a narrative. Some of them are. And that's why Real Clear tries to do that average, because it's hard to actually see what's really going on when some polls are trying to push a certain narrative towards Harris.
Yep, and I do have some of those numbers up. So starting in the beginning of October, we see this split where Trump is now leading, and it gets to a point where he's about, 58 into the low 60s, whereas Harris starts polling in the 40s and even as low as, the high 30s in this poly market,
Mhm.
race.
And one point to what Michael said that he was actually the one thing prediction markets were wrong about is they only thought Trump had about a 20% chance of winning the popular vote. It was about 18 to 25 kind of going through it. So that was
Oh,
actually the one area they were way wrong in. So that's one
interesting.
where basically, and as somebody who bet that market at 5 to 1, it's like, I mean, you're basically saying that he's got a 1 in 5 chance of winning the popular vote, which, it felt low, even based on, like you said, Real Clear Politics. They're saying it's a toss up. Why? I mean, getting 20% value, but I'm still looking at past elections where I don't think Democrats have lost the popular vote since Reagan. It's been a long time since they've actually lost the popular vote.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, it
Yeah, it
might
might
be
be.
88. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think George Bush won in
The first
2004.
time? Okay. I'd be interested to
Well,
see that.
the second time. I think the
Okay.
second time he won the popular vote. He may not have hit 50, but I think he won the popular vote.
But yes, that is one where even though it was a great and the market's right about everything, they were not right about that. And there is still values because again, it's people betting just like when they bet sports. There might be a team that's a 21-point favorite. And all the data might be right to make them a 21-point favorite, but they can still lose because you never know what's going to happen when the actual election happens.
So,
Right.
just for our audience, I just want to make sure that you just noticed. You heard it here first. Mark admitted that prediction markets are not perfect.
Not perfect.
Right here.
There you go. There you go. All right. And I kind of want to look at some other races, not just the 2024 presidential, but also we had a Overton Insights poll released last week, and we polled the 2028 Republican and Democratic primaries. So we're still a little ways off from the election, but it's still interesting to kind of look at what that is as we approach midterms next year. But we saw in the Republican primary that current Vice President Vance had a slim lead over Donald Trump Jr., and we saw all the other candidates in this race falling much farther behind. Yet in, these prediction markets, we see Vice President Vance already now with, 50+% of the vote, and no one else is anywhere near him. All these other candidates are in, single digits. And we see the same thing with the Democratic primary. In our poll, we see Newsom with over a third of the vote, no other candidates super close to him. And we even see Kamala Harris, sorry, let me adjust that. In our poll, we see that Harris was the clear leader. When we polled back in July, the presidential election or the presidential primary without Harris, we saw Newsom with a tie across a couple other candidates in that race. Yet when we look at Polymarket in these prediction markets, that's where we see this huge jump ahead lead, where we see Gavin Newsom way ahead of these other candidates, even with Harris in single digits in that race. So pardon me on that adjustment. But Michael, I'd love to hear your take on why you think this might be. Granted, we are still far out from these elections, but what would you say when you see these disparities?
Well, the first thing I would say is, in many respects, I think both the prediction market and the polls have the same issue, and that is that both of these are more name ID type predictions or whatnot. They're not really, who are you going to vote for or who do you think's going to win? Because the prediction market, I think, is like, oh yeah, who's got name ID, who's big out there, and who, I think this guy can win, and most of these other people, I don't even know who they are, or if they can win. And I think that's very much the case for a poll. A poll right now is very much a name ID thing, not a who's going to win. So I think that's where you see start to see that disparity, because I think in a prediction market, very much people are still asking the question, well, who do I think will win? But a big part of that is name ID, right? Because right now there are other candidates out there whose name ID is not as high, and they might win that election, right? There's people out there who I would be curious, right, if we went back to, because the similarity would be if we went back to 2013, right, and saw where was Donald Trump in the polls on the like of winning the 2016 presidential election, and I'm going to guess that he was nowhere, and he won.
Right. Well, Mark, I see you kind of have a
Yeah.
thought, so I'll let you go on that.
I actually, so I agree half with Michael, but then I disagree in the other half. So I think that the name ID thing is absolutely correct with polls. That's what the issue is. That's why Harris is winning, because everyone remembers her. I think it's actually the exact opposite in the prediction markets. People are looking at, I think fundraising is number one, to be honest. They're looking at that before, but they are looking at polls. But the name ID doesn't really, again, because it's people putting their money, I don't think that people are really using name ID. But with that being said, I think it's important because I have a bold kind of, maybe not prediction, but getting Kamala Harris at 4.4 cents, they're saying she has a 4.4% chance of winning the Democratic nomination, is super good value. I don't understand why people are not taking her seriously. And forget your political views or whatever. Getting her at 20-1 odds for the last nominee, she's winning in these early polls. And it's important to remember that, this is very similar, in my opinion, to what Mitt Romney did. He was a 2020 or 2008. He lost in the Republican primary. People said, "Oh yeah, whatever," but he was leading a lot of the polls early on, and even the small prediction markets there didn't care for him. But the point is that everyone's like, oh, well, he's going to fall out. Somebody else will come in there. It never happened. He was the 2012 nominee. And yeah, it was a tough primary, but this feels a lot like Harris, where if you have a little money, I'm not giving betting advice, but I think Harris at 4.4 cents is an unbelievable value, because and a lot of people don't like Newsom. There's not another clear candidate right now. Like Michael said, somebody will definitely come out of the woodwork, but I think that's great value. And our polling shows that she's up by double digits on Newsom, and that might change. But for now, why would you not take a double digit favorite at 4.4%?
I just want to say, and I know we're not going to do this, but it would just be so much fun to have a little ticker on the bottom of Mark that says, hot buy or sell now. That would be so much fun. But I did want to clarify one thing about what Mark said. I don't think that prediction market people are looking at name ID. What I'm saying is there's an inherent bias in them because they only know what they know. And so name ID is going to be a part of it because they're just biased that way of who they know and who they don't.
Yep. And just to clarify, we are not giving financial advice here today. So do with that information what you will. All right, I'm going to change gears a little bit. And we just last week ended the longest government shutdown in history. It lasted 43 days. And we have a lot of people coming out of that and coming out of the off year elections saying that this long government shutdown played a part in influencing some of these elections. So we saw sweeping Democrat victories across states like Virginia, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and even in New York City. And so this leaves many people, including President Trump himself, saying that the government shutdown has contributed to some of these GOP losses. So I want to bring up one number from our poll first, and then we'll kind of get into some questions about that and break it down. But our recent Overton Insights poll says that 85% of voters personally care about the government shutdown. And this was in the field, at the height of the government shutdown right before the elections. So this is kind of catching all of that sentiment. And we see Republicans and Democrats aligned with this number, both high majorities. And this is also across the board of all of the age groups. So everyone from, your Gen Z young voters to these baby boomers are all saying they personally care about the government shutdown. So, Mark, I'd love to hear where you stand on this. Do you think the shutdown influenced elections? And is people personally caring about this something that we can kind of reflect into where they might, vote?
Yeah, I mean, and Michael might have a different opinion than me on this. I think the shutdowns did have some benefit to the Democrats, but it makes sense why Trump would blame that. I mean, he is 12 points underwater. That's going to have a bigger issue on Republicans than the shutdown does. He is not, I mean, again, take your own personal politics out of it. He is not popular, and people on the right are even leaving saying, this is a little bit too much for me in some way. So honestly, I think he's more to blame in the way that, how people view him in the first 2 years than the government shutdown is. I do think it had a mild effect towards the Democrats, which, from a PR perspective, the Democrats won the comms war in there. Whether or not it's like, I don't agree with a lot of what they said, but they did win the comms war where like, despite the fact that they were the ones kind of that voted against the continuing resolution, they made it seem like it was the Republicans' fault. So from a cons perspective, you have to give them credit. Afterwards, it said the Republicans won the shutdown, but I don't know, the Democrats, I think, had a clear idea that let's bring this into the election. I think that was part of the calculus. Let's try to pick up seats and then we'll solve it, as soon as we get our people in power there.
Michael, do you agree with Mark on this, or do you have a different kind of analysis?
I think my view is much more nuanced, and it just comes from, working on campaigns and being in elections. And that's where, the 40% on the right and the 40% on the left, they think what they're going to think and they're on their team. And so that doesn't really matter. It's really a question of where the 20% in the middle were on the shutdown, and where those moderates were. And I think you see that obviously they were a little bit more on the Democrats, which is what we were seeing in polls, that slightly the Democrats were ahead on the shutdown as it was happening. And because of that, I don't think it actually affected the election very much, because I think that's just more of a reflection of where people were at with just the general Republican administration and what was going on in Congress and just what they felt generally. It wasn't necessarily like, oh, the shutdown, oh, I'm really all about it, or really, really against it. I think people, it was very split. And so it's not like a regular issue that impacts the election where it's like, oh, 70% of people think the economy is failing, and so therefore I'm going to vote against the current administration. It was not an issue like that. So I would not blame the shutdown for what you saw happen.
Let me bring up one other thing that I think is kind of important. It's not just about the moderates and where they go. It's these people who are incentivized to turn out in an off-year election that would not normally turn out. If you, especially on the left, and you saw New York City, you saw New Jersey. I mean, they had huge turnout numbers. So whether that was because the shutdown, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but they were incentivized to vote, which is the biggest issue that, I think Harris had this past, is like how many people just didn't show up for her, where they're like, oh, I'm going to sit out. So I think, and I don't know how the shutdown played into that, but that's a big part of it as well.
Yeah, no, Mark's right. Yeah, turnout is a whole nother thing. And we didn't even talk about that when we talked about the accuracy of polls and stuff. Because a lot of times everyone, including our discussion earlier, we treat all things equal. But the participants change from election to election. And a lot of times that's not talked about.
Right. And then one thing I do want to bring up, we kind of touched on this in terms of like who is winning the quote unquote shutdown, who won this. So we see an Economist YouGov poll come out after the shutdown was over, and they said that Republicans won the shutdown plus 33%. And there were a lot of people that said neither side won as well. So what does that kind of mean? Does that hold any value? Do you think, that, played any role in elections, or is it all just a media conversation?
I, I,
Michael, yeah.
I think the word won, who won is the wrong way to look at it. It's really who lost. I don't think there's any winning of the shutdown. It's more that the Democrats were saying we're doing this for this reason. We're doing this for this reason. It will be worth it. It will be worth it.
Mhm.
And then they did not fulfill on that promise. So therefore, they lose. I don't think that you could really say that the Republicans won the shutdown. They just didn't lose.
Right, right.
I mean, they also lost every contested election during there. So, like, I don't feel like that feels much like winning. Every election across the country that felt like it went to the Democrats. So they could say they won afterwards, but it doesn't feel like they won.
Well, again, I think those are two different issues.
Yeah.
How I feel about the shutdown is, on November 10th or whenever we open back up, or maybe that was earlier this week, is very different from who am I going to vote for. Those are, again, two different questions. And again, I would maintain that the shutdown did not actually impact the election very much, because I'm just telling you, it shutdown or no shutdown, I think the results of the election would have been the same.
And I actually agree
Right.
with Mike on that. And I feel like there's this thing on the right specifically. Do you remember COVID and how like after the post COVID election, like, oh, Republicans are going to dominate, they're going to do these things, and it didn't actually end up mattering that much. The actual COVID
Yeah.
shutdowns, when you look at a year after, everyone, the media kept talking about it. It had very little impact on, like, people were strongly about it, but the way that the elections turned out, it had very little impact. And it feels like this was more of a media narrative about the government shutdown affecting elections than probably it actually did.
And
See, my point is that a question about COVID, a question about the shutdown, is really a question about how people are feeling right now and
Yeah.
what they think. It's not really a, oh man, this is going one way or the other. No, it's like this is where people are at. And so that's why I say it doesn't really impact things, because that's just how people are feeling.
right, and there is this conversation too of maybe that, the government shutdown and all of the media attention surrounding all of that and these narratives are kind of contributing to this feeling of general instability and concern. And maybe that kind of, I don't want to speak for you, Michael, but it seemed like that's kind of what you were saying. People were more concerned about, this general political instability and broader concerns versus just specifically the government shutdown.
Well, and even bigger than that is just, if we talk about predictors, who's in power and who's not in power. That's probably the biggest predictor of midterm elections.
Right. And then I'm kind of going to go on this trend of sort of political instability and talk about some of our other poll results from this recent November poll. So we've been asking people about the sentiment of political homelessness. And we define that as, identifying with neither of the major political parties and not really feeling like you have a quote unquote home within one of these parties' platforms. And we've seen an increase in this since July when we first asked this question of voters. And right now we have nearly half of all voters saying they identify as politically homeless. And right now, that's more Democrats than Republicans. Mark, what do you generally attribute this sentiment to?
Well, I think the Democrats have a real problem that people aren't necessarily talking about, is that there's a lot of people unhappy with the party, but they're not unhappy in a consistent way. A lot of people said, oh, they didn't go far enough left. They didn't embrace Zohran Mamdani. They didn't embrace AOC. But then you have other people, like, they need to moderate. They're too far left right now. So when you see people unhappy with the Democratic Party, that's on both sides. And that's going to be really hard. They got to try to thread that needle of kind of, and AOC's trying to do it right now, of keep the establishment Democrats happy, but still have the kind of the very far left progressive people. The Republicans is kind of a different story. It seems like it's just kind of anti-Trump sentiment. That's why people are disillusioned with them. And it's not even necessarily too far right in the way you would say. It's just they don't like him personally. So I think it's interesting, and it makes sense to me that Republicans are far less interested in a third party than the Democrats are. But that's why the Democratic leadership, in my opinion, is failing right now. They are trying to figure this out, but like they're trying to keep everyone happy, and at some point that's not going to work. So that number, I think it was almost 40% of Democrats basically felt disillusioned with their party. That's a real problem, and that's something they have to figure out with these two factions really trying to kind of take over the party.
Right, yeah, it was about 36% of Democrats, 27% of Republicans. And so this kind of leads me into this conversation of what do we see in the 2028 elections? We're far off, but we do see in our poll that, Newsom leads Vance by 3%. We can say that has to do with maybe name ID for both of these candidates. But what I think is interesting to look at is that Newsom has this very strong lead among independents. What type of leader are the moderates looking for in this, 2028 election? Why do you think Newsom is that candidate right now? And where do you think that might go? Michael, I'd love if you could kind of comment on this.
That's an interesting question. I think for people on the middle, going in the opposite direction of what we were just talking about, polarization and being upset with some of the things going on, who's going to bring stability? Who's going to be a more moderating influence, and not necessarily in terms of issues like, oh, who's going to bring us to the middle, more of who's going to bring a respectable statesman-like approach. And that's where I think it's interesting what Newsom's doing right now, because he is trying to be a little more like Trumpy and a counter. So I'll be curious to see what happens there with people on the middle. But again, I would say the main reason Newsom's doing well right now is he's the one who people perceive as going to have the most money, the most name ID, the biggest chance. But that doesn't mean that he will actually win the nomination.
I really like what Michael said, because I think it's important. Like, when they say moderate, they mean rhetoric. They don't care about policy. People who can have a moderate rhetoric, they're viewed as moderate. There's people like Roy Cooper. There's these people who are viewed as moderate. Like, they're not. They just have this really good way of talking about things. And Newsom is doing a good job of that. He's talking in a moderate way. I don't think his record necessarily indicates that he's moderate. I mean, you could argue about that. He's kind of come to the middle on some, but it really is about rhetoric more than it is actually how they vote or their policy.
And I think it's interesting to think about that too, because while Newsom isn't leading in our Democratic primary polling, he is leading when we look at who the leader of the Democratic Party is by a very slim margin. And there's a lot of people who still aren't sure about this, but we see Newsom with 22% of the vote and Harris with 19. So she's falling behind a little bit, but we see this huge number of almost 40% of voters who don't know who the Democratic Party leader is. Is that going to be a big challenge for them? And do you think it's just going to be someone coming out of the woodwork to fix that? Maybe Mark, you can speak to this a little bit further. But what is it going to take for the Democrats to find a party leader by 2028?
Yeah, I think what Michael said earlier is right. It's like somebody's trying to come out of the woodwork. They don't know. I just feel like Democrats generally are unhappy with these options. I mean, Harris, who was second, she just lost. I mean, she lost badly, based on presidential elections, especially for Republican candidates. So they're like, well, do I want to trust her? And as much, Newsom does have people who really don't like him in that party too. He might have a group of people like, oh, I'm glad he's fighting back. I'm glad he's moderating. There is these people, but I think even people who like him and view him as the head of the party would like somebody better. I think that they view somebody like Obama and hope that somebody like that will come out of the woodwork in the meantime. And there is these people, but I really want to give a lot of credit to Gavin Newsom, because he has really changed his image in about 6 months to a year. I mean, it was not that long ago. We were talking about a recall election where he might lose to Larry Elder. That was a conversation we had 2 years ago. He has really turned it around, and as a comms person, I think his communications team is doing an excellent job. He's kind of having the fire to go against Trump, but also moderating his image in other ways. So I don't know if that will, it seems like a lot of people, and maybe Michael can talk about this, think it's inauthentic. And if that is the case, that might eventually catch up to him. But right now he's doing a great job. I would also bet that he's not the nominee. And I don't have a specific person I'd pick over him, but I bet it's in that, what Michael said, that 40% of people who don't know what their person is yet, they're going to find someone, and that's probably going to be the nominee.
If I were to guess, I'm going to guess that the Democrats aren't really going to be able to figure it out and come up with a leader by the next election, because right now everything has been a reaction to Trump. And so whoever is next, or if Trump continues to be the main influence, I think that's really going to dictate where the Democrats go. And again, if it's like another Trump-esque person, I think they will continue with we are anti this populist whatever, that's where they'll continue to go. But if it's somebody different, then that might allow a different leader to emerge as a counter to whatever the Republicans put up. But we won't know that until the Republicans select a nominee.
Right, so we'll stay tuned for another couple of years. We can come back and have this conversation then. All right, so I have one last question for you guys before we wrap up today, and that is, what is the one issue or race in, this political landscape right now that you are going to kind of keep your eye on in terms of the polls or prediction markets for the next little while? Do you have something you're kind of interested in? What are you keeping your eye on? What should other people be keeping their eye on? Kind of speak to what that looks like for you guys. Mark, do you want to?
I'll let Mark go first.
Okay. Yeah, there's a couple races that I think are interesting. That and I think it's always when you're talking about this, looking at swing states. I think Ohio's interesting. That the governor race there, it's interesting to see if Ramaswamy will win, or a lot of people are talking about Ohio, but they have this, they're going to have Sherrod Brown running too, and he's like this, he's going to be running for Senate against John Huston. He is a moderate sounding anyway person who was in office for a long time, and if he can keep that close or even win Ohio, that's one of the ones you're looking at if you're a Democrat, because if he wins that, they're taking the Senate over. That's a huge seat, and I think that, in my opinion, people have gone too far saying Ohio is no longer even close to a swing state. I think Republicans are getting ahead of themselves there. Same with Florida. Like, they should kind of chill out on that. There's, one or two bad election cycles. They could easily lose that, or a really good, strong candidate, which Sherrod Brown is. So that'll be interesting. I think the Michigan Senate seat will be an interesting one, because places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, those are kind of the weird states where we're trying to figure out, are those Trump states that only he can win, or are they open for other Republicans? Trump kind of has this interesting, blue collar appeal that a lot of other Republicans did not have. So it'll be interesting once he's out of power and he's not running anymore, although he says he's going to keep running. So we'll see what happens. But assuming he doesn't run for a third term, it'll be interesting to see how those states view Republicans, and then what the Republican candidates look like. Are those kind of more pro-union candidates, more on the J.D. Vance line? Or are they going to be kind of more the firebrand, or just the old school Republicans? So we will see. But those are the three states I'm looking at.
Okay. Michael, do you have something you're keeping your eye on?
Well, I think for me, it's going to be about next year's midterms generally. And what I mean by that is, I feel like you had two distinctive campaigns in Virginia and New York City. And so I think you will see Democratic candidates looking at that and trying to adopt that during the midterms. So it's a question of, will that be successful? Will people be able to have a narrative that's not necessarily Trump driven, but more of a Democrat message, and see how that does? The other part of that with the midterms is Republicans have not been able to really figure out how to win without Trump on the ballot. And they haven't really been able to figure out how to win being Trumpy, but not being Trump. So those two questions, I'll be curious to see how that turns out in the midterms, because that is going to directly impact the 2028 race about how you see those two sides go at it in the general election.
I really like Michael's point too about this, because we've always talked about, like the 2022, remember the red wave that was going to happen that never happened. Trump wasn't on the ballot, and we kept hearing, Republicans are taking over this and this because they're unhappy with Democrats. It never existed, and honestly, Democrats barely suffered any losses. So it is worth noting that they only have done well with Trump on the ballot, which is kind of the opposite, I think, of conventional wisdom in some cases. But he gets the voters out that they need to win. So I think that's a good point that he made there.
I would also disagree with the idea that Republicans do well with Trump on the ballot. I would actually argue that Trump only helps himself. He does not actually help anybody else. When you look at the elections where Trump is on the ballot, everybody else is like lower than him a lot of the times, and they're not matching. It does not match. Trump does not equate. His coattails are not like traditional coattails.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do think the Senate, I mean, they definitely picked up some seats in the Senate this year with him that they would have gotten without him, I think. But generally, especially in 2020, or none of it, went to the actual Senate races. All of them lost. And obviously, he still lost to Biden. I mean, I guess some people say he didn't, but he did lose to Biden. But the key being that none of the Senate people, they didn't help the Senate people at all. It didn't help down ballot. So I agree generally. The only benefit it has is sometimes it will bring out more Republican voters, but you need to have good candidates. I mean, you see what happened in Arizona. Ruben Gallego won, who was very far left because they are not recruiting good candidates. So I think the candidate quality still matters. And it's something that I think the national media has kind of forgotten about a little bit. It's not just Trump. You need good quality candidates who basically get Trump's base without alienating middle of the road voters. And that's tough to do.
Okay, well, thank you guys so much for being here today. I appreciate all of your input. That is it for this week's episode of The Polling Alley. Thanks for joining us as we analyze the data and uncover the insights shaping today's political landscape. If you enjoyed the conversation, make sure to follow and subscribe. You can find more insights and analysis from our team at Overton Insights by following us on X at Overton Insights and visiting overtoninsights.com. We'll be back soon. Thanks for listening.